In the beginning, Word, life, light, grace, truth, flesh. These words have a timeless poetry about them. All the more so maybe because we listen to them in the middle of the night amongst these stones and candles, just as people have listened to them for centuries, millennia even. In the beginning, Word, life, light, grace, truth, flesh. The Celts talk about thin places where time seems to stand still and where you feel you can reach back in time and sense the story of your ancestors. Thin places in Aotearoa tend to be marae or urupa, but also churches, or summer batches where childhood memories can come flooding back. It might just take the scent of the pahutakawa, or the taste of a barbecued sausage, or the sand between your toes to remind you of those carefree summer days when holidays meant holidays with no email or phones to interrupt you. In the beginning, Word, life, light, grace, truth, flesh. These words at the beginning of John's Gospel also trigger memories and reflections in the lives of the people of faith that John wrote for. This tale John is about to weave begins in the beginning of time, way back in the creation stories of Genesis, back in ancient times of which no one has any memories. And so John weaves a tale of life that began in the beginning and now breaks in upon the world in a new way. This life comes not in the sea and stars and sun and moon as life did at the genesis of time, but this life comes in flesh, in human flesh, in the ordinary and the everyday. John does not tell us the tale of the baby and the shepherds and the wise men, but he tells us the essence of the tale. Jesus, the Word, became flesh and lived among us. God was always incarnate, embodied, enfleshed in the people, but often they couldn't see it. They kept God separated in that holy of holies in the temple, or maybe somewhere in the sky. And no matter how many times the prophet said, God is here now, with the poor and the oppressed and the captives, no matter how many times the prophet said that, the people still thought that God was far away and remote and separate. And so the Word became flesh and lived among us. Jesus lived in Palestine at a specific time, in a specific place. He taught and ate and drank and prayed and healed and was killed for his teaching. And yet because he was Word and life and light and grace and truth and flesh, and because he was all of those things within flesh, death could not be the end for him. And so John wrote his tale that we might seek grace and truth within ourselves and within each other. God had always been incarnate and embodied and enfleshed in the people, and they hadn't seen it. But perhaps now they might. Perhaps now we might. John begins his tale describing Jesus as the Word, capital W. Greeks thought of the word, capital W, the logos. They thought of it as a philosophical idea to describe order in the universe, and it was definitely not flesh. It was separate, intellectual, kind of the pattern of the universe. And so for John to bring us this beautiful poem of word, life, light, grace and truth, all of those kind of ethereal things, for him to bring that to us in the flesh, was really quite scandalous. That God, or the fact that God or the philosophical word could become flesh and become humanity was completely ridiculous and quite shocking. The creation story tells us that God spoke the world into being. Let there be light, God said, and there was light. But it's another step altogether for the word, capital W, to become flesh and human with all our physicality, with our sweat and our tears, and our birth and death, and sex and passion, and food and drink, and clothes and homes. Being flesh, being of the world, was not what the Word was about, nor what God was about. And yet Jesus was born on this holy night in unholy circumstances, with real people and real animals and real dangers all around. And so, in the reality of our lives, Jesus, therefore, can also be born. In our sweat and tears, in our birth and death, sex and passion, food and drink, clothes and homes. Into all of that, Jesus is born. And the word, capital W, becomes part of our words, little w, our words that can profess love or hate, our words that can encourage or shame. What words do we most long to hear? I love you. I am proud of you. I miss you. And what words do we hear often instead? Angry words on social media, on the news, in our homes, anger and disappointment. If this story of the Word becoming flesh is to be real, then we need to allow our words to change as well as our lives are changed. Our own words change, and our lives are changed. Because this life of grace and truth is there for all who seek it. These words don't just belong in the Bible. The question for us here tonight is, how does this tale of word and life and light and grace and truth become enfleshed in our lives? One way tonight is in the simple ritual of receiving the bread and wine of the Eucharist, of the communion. If this is the first time you've been in church for a while, or ever, you're welcome to come and receive the bread and the wine, symbols of the life of Christ. Because in participating in this communion, we are reminded of the physicality of God. Not distant in some faraway heavenly realm, but here now, in word and in action, the body of Christ given for you. And so we invite you tonight to allow God to be present with you, in you. Because in the beginning was the Word. In him was life, and the life was the light of all people. And the Word became flesh and lived among us, full of grace and truth.